Welcome back, everybody, to the Fretboard Journal podcast. I'm your host, Jason Verlinde. As always, that's John Rauhaus playing in the background. And today on the show, I'm talking to our dear friend, guitarist Paul Asbell. Undoubtedly, many of you have met Paul at guitar shows or luthier showcases around the country. He's a fixture at things like our Fretboard Summit, as well as the Artisan Guitar Show. You may know that Paul had a band called Kilimanjaro in his home of Burlington, Vermont that was wildly influential. And some of you may even know Paul for giving guitar lessons to a young Trey Anastasio from Fish. You may not know, though, Paul's backstory, which is what we're talking about today. And Paul has a brand new book out called Stages, where he documents the pivotal handful of years when he was a working, gigging musician in the South Side of Chicago, essentially the only white musician on stage, more often than not. And he really got to meet a whole bunch of blues legends as well as some folk heroes over those years. And he writes beautifully about them in Stages, the new book. There are QR codes if anybody wants to tee up music as they're reading Paul's tales. And I wanted to hear all about how this book came to be. I wanted to hear more about his time in Chicago, as well as what brought him to Vermont, and so much more. It's a great chat. I will include a link to Stages, Paul's book, in the show notes. So if anybody wants to grab a copy, he's even autographing them. It would make for a great gift. I have the book. I wholly recommend it to all of you. I also recommend that if you haven't subscribed to the Fretboard Journal yet, now is your chance, because our 58th issue is at press and going to be mailing to everybody next month. And so if you want to just start 2026 with the world's coolest guitar magazine, here is your chance. It's our 58th issue. We also have a whole bunch of great gifts on our website, including our Luthier's Toolbox book and some merch. So if anyone out there is looking for a cool gift for a friend or a bandmate, we have you covered. And our sponsors have you covered too. Peghead Nation is a place where you can go learn how to be a better guitarist, mandolin player, banjo player, in all sorts of different genres. So many of their instructors are Fretboard Journal subjects or contributors. And it's my favorite place to just get a little bit better at bluegrass, Americana, jazz, and so much more. Use the discount code Fretboard and you can get your first month free. We're also brought to you by Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar right here in Seattle, Washington. One of my favorite guitar stores to visit. They just have a very beautifully curated store. So come on out to Seattle, go see them, or go to mmguitarbar.com and tell them the Fretboard Journal sent you. And then last but not least, our Fretboard Summit, we now are taking registration on. It's going to be taking place August 20th to 22nd, 2026 in Chicago, once again at the Old Town School of Folk Music. This is sort of my vision for the ultimate guitar festival for like-minded guitar fanatics. There are exhibitors and luthiers from around the world showing off their latest creations. There are tons of workshops. There are tons of oral histories and lectures. And most importantly, though, it's an incredible place to connect with other guitar fanatics, as well as see some just mind-bogglingly great music that will inspire you for years to come. So go to fretboardsummit.org, sign up. You can stay anywhere you want in Chicago. It doesn't matter to me. But from, 10 a.m. till around 10 p.m., the Old Town School of Folk Music is going to be where you're going to want to be for all 3 days. It's a super fun guitar event and probably the only place in the world where you can get your hands on hundreds of high-end acoustic and electric boutique-made guitars, as well as some vintage instruments. It's just a really cool array. And there's a good chance you're going to see today's guest, Paul Asbell, at the next one. So I'm going to let my conversation with Paul take it away. Again, the new book that he just wrote, it's so good, is called Stages. Go check it out. And here is my conversation with him. Well, Paul Asbell, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice being here, Jason, and seeing you again after, it's been like over a year from the last Fretboard Journal that I was able to make it to.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about this incredible project that is out into the world right now, this book that you've written. But I think just a little backstory. Most people at least in the modern boutique guitar community, know you as one of the, handful of people who's been at all the Healdsburgs and all the Newport guitar shows and the artisan shows. And you're sort of this, incredibly talented guitarist who I think a lot of people think of as sort of, one of those great acoustic technicians. And so I'm reading this book that you just came out with, Stages, which we're going to get way into. Cool. And your career is so much more than that. I mean, it's incredible.
Well, I think you're right. I hope it doesn't sound immodest to say that, but it's true that if you live long enough and if you've done enough different kind of things in different arenas, it's easy to not know, oh, that guy did that. And I'm certainly not the only person who falls into that category. But other than playing in, blues groups and stuff like that in the Northeast, that idea of, how did he learn to play that kind of stuff? And the answer kind of is in the book in a lot of ways. And that is different than what people kind of would see if they've seen me a bunch at some of the guitar shows that is our connection, if you know what I mean.
Totally. So the book, we'll just cut to the chase, is called Stages, Ruminations, Rants, and Reminiscences on a Life in Music. And it really beautifully documents in these sort of short vignettes your time in Chicago. And I guess let's just get into it. Where did you originally grow up? And then how did you find yourself in Chicago?
Well, I originally grew up in Chicago.
Yep.
So, and some of the stories, obviously I'm a musician, and obviously a lot of the stories are at least tangentially about music and my career in music and stuff. But one or two of the things are a little bit more, they're not like, Paul's memoir or something like that, or at least I never thought of it that way when I was writing those pieces. But they definitely touch on growing up on the south side of Chicago in what is a kind of an unusual way. There's a photograph in one of the stories of Bousfield, kindergarten, 1955. And here's Paul. Wait a minute, where's Paul? Well, there's 40 other kids. And if you look here, the one white kid. I guess that must be Paul. And, the picture kind of speaks volumes in a way of what my early life in Chicago was like. And there's kind of a backstory of why did I wind up not just in sort of the South Side, but in basically a neighborhood that's called Bronzeville and has been called Bronzeville for probably 80 to 100 years. And, just bronze refers to the color of the people who lived there, with a couple of notable exceptions. And that largely due to my parents and choices that they made to move to Chicago to be part of something called People's Songs, which my mom, Millie, and my dad, Bernie, kind of headed up in 1946. And that's where they moved to because it was an inexpensive place to live. And it was a place that politically kind of jived with what their whole thing was about. And so little Paul kind of would walking around on these streets, walking to kindergarten several blocks from our house on 47th and Drexel to this kindergarten that, a lot of people, much later would say, wait a second, you walked around as a kid? Yeah. And anyway, I never thought about it at the time until much later, which I think is true of all of us when we grow up in a certain situation. You don't really think about wow, that's weird that I'm a white kid and then there's everybody around me is black. That's really strange. Maybe other people do. I never did. It was kind of lost on me until much later when I reflected on it and how did that happen and what does that mean?
Yeah. So talk about People's Songs, because this is this whole story is so I've never heard of any story like yours. It's kind of crazy. I have a million questions, even after having read most of the book. And so your parents, very obviously progressive.
Yeah.
And they moved from New York to Chicago to start a branch of what is People's Songs? How would you describe it?
Well, I'll back up a bit. Yeah. My parents met in New York and they met in the environment. My dad had heard about this place in Greenwich Village where certain people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Cisco Houston and a couple of others, I mean, I could then name them, people who are familiar with that history could supply them themselves. They got together and, were writing songs based on, a shared political philosophy. You said it pretty well, it was the progressivism of the time. It was a labor movement was very much alive. Civil rights was being talked about by some, black leaders, but this was one of the not necessarily 100% black groups that kind of supported that and, evangelized for that. And my dad wrote a bunch of songs that actually, got recorded and published and sung by a whole bunch of others. It's one characteristic one, which he was not necessarily proud of later in life, but it's called The Song of My Hands. And you can kind of see the significance of, labor movement kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's echoes in today hugely, right? That's a whole nother conversation. But, my dad didn't stay all his life being that guy, but certainly for 10 years, he was part of that movement. He didn't change politically very much, but he was in being, and so they moved to Chicago to form the Midwest chapter of People's Songs. And he concertized with Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger would come to the house often when I was a kid. I never thought of him as, wow, this is Pete Seeger. He's just this guy who showed up, and kind of came in with a banjo case and an axe. And that was the one thing that I remember as a kid, which is, that's weird. We're in Chicago. Why does he have an axe? And it was much later that I figured out what it was, because he did a lot of concertizing at that time, where one of the things he would talk about is demonstrate work songs, a la, Leadbelly and a la, the folks in prison who were recorded by Alan Lomax. And he wanted to talk about that, thread of American culture. And he always could find a piece of wood wherever he was to be that, but he couldn't always find an axe. So he traveled with an axe and a banjo case. And I'm guessing he had a small suitcase as well, but I just didn't remember. So at any rate, that guy, friend of my dad's, was Pete Seeger, who I remember from childhood. And of course, somewhat later, that's my friend of my dad. And I would see Pete much later when I was a professional musician, and our paths would often cross at various festivals or something like that. Me doing something quite different by then. But at any rate, we would reconnect. And
wild, just so wild, and especially Pete Seeger needing to bring his own 9-pound hammer or whatever he had.
Right, exactly. That's
props.
Illusion.
Your dad, thought he would save the world with this movement, or this was just part of the culture?
Well, you're burrowing into a really interesting, to me, and a very complex kind of thing in terms of my dad, because people at the time were true believers, very, very much like we see today. Echoes of today are everywhere in that movement. And so not only did he write songs to support that, in the way that Phil Oakes did 20 years later, for example, and Pete, of course, did. But he also, my dad campaigned, and my mom was part of this too, campaigned for the Henry Wallace campaign in 1948, which was a quite lefty kind of thing. My dad was never a communist but he was blacklisted as sort of a communist sympathizer or whatever, a fellow traveler, which is the term, the McCarthy era term. So, it impacted his career hugely. And that part I did get a whiff of, because Dad would sort of have to kind of go from various writing gigs to writing gigs, kind of a little bit under the radar, because the blacklist very much affected his ability to write for larger magazines. And I skipped over a little detail, which is at some point, my dad discovered that his destiny, his why am I on earth kind of thing was writing, not guitar playing. I don't think he ever really thought, oh yeah, I'm like a guitar player and, that's my gig. Or even I'm a songwriter and that's my gig. Once he found writing, as he told me many times, it was like, this is what I was put on earth to do. And when he did that, interestingly enough, he stopped being part of the bumper sticker sloganeering kind of world, because he saw the world as a much, much bigger place than like one, placard or, one slogan that you slap on your bumper. And he lost touch to a certain degree with some of the people who were the true believers that he grew up with, if you know what I mean. And it was, I can't entirely speak for it, but because I think he was quite happy where he landed. But I think he had, I think there had some sad feelings about losing touch with people who didn't understand that sometimes in influencing people and influencing culture, you want to do it by seeing a larger picture instead of kind of carrying a placard in a demonstration, and that's your thing.
Yeah. I feel like I need to interject here. This book is highly entertaining and has stories of Big Bill Broonzy, Matt Guitar Murphy, Muddy Waters, all these people who you've crossed paths with or intersected with. It's not super socio whatever we want to call it. It's your tales of being a guitarist in the South Side of Chicago and then growing through that. When did guitar enter your life?
Well, my dad played guitar.
Yeah.
So when I was 10 or 11, I started thinking, the things that I hear my dad do, that's just what my dad does. But he has these 78s, and I just kind of checked them out in the back of the record cabinet. And like, holy smoke, this guy, what's the deal with this guy, Blind Willie Johnson? And how does he make that kind of singing sound on the guitar? And like, Uncle Dave Macon, well, I can tell that's a banjo because my dad played with people who play the banjo. But like, what, and any of the Carter family and a whole bunch of stuff that I sort of, my window into it at first was my dad's 78s. But again, I didn't necessarily think, oh man, I got to play guitar. But at some point I kind of connected that my dad and what he does playing guitar, there is this guitar hanging on the wall. I'm kind of curious to see, what I can do with it. And around 11, that's what I did. And at first, obviously, I had heard Bob Dylan by then. And I had heard, that's not true. I'd heard Woody Guthrie and people like that who were playing accompaniments much like my dad that weren't all that dauntingly, staggeringly complicated looking. And I thought, I could sort of do that. But what I kind of really want to do is this guy, Lightnin' Hopkins, who is on this one of these 70. I mean, what is that? And is there some way I can wrap my head around that? My dad wasn't any help with that. He didn't pretend to. But so I had to find my way with that. But my dad kind of introduced me to the basic chord shapes and stuff like that. And but at some point, I just kind of struck out on my own because playing like Woody Guthrie isn't necessarily the be all end all. I could see that like these records by John Lee Hooker and Lightnin' Hopkins, and somehow along the way in about 62, I discovered this guy named Doc Watson, and holy smoke. And this is way beyond anything I'm ever going to get from my dad. So I kind of set to work. And in my case, work was going up in my upstairs bedroom and doing all the things that somebody as old as I am could talk about, dropping the needle on the record and like, what was that? And pulling it back, trying not to scratch the record process to try, there was no kind of audio software that will just slow down the thing. And yeah, it was kind of very analog and I did a lot of that.
And you were living in ground zero for the Chicago blues scene. Was this music all around you too? Or was it just, I'm at home, I'm listening to the records my dad curated and whatever I've
You're not
procured?
far wrong with that. The only thing being that I was not able to get in the clubs at that time. And so I knew, on the one hand, I would listen to that record, Chicago, the Blues Today. That was it's a 3-volume set for anybody who likes music like what I do. Incredible, open door into what Chicago blues was like in the 60s. And that hit me very hard. So I discovered Buddy Guy from that, and Junior Wells, and Johnny Young, and Johnny Shines, and James Cotton. And anyway, but I shouldn't say I discovered. I'd heard some of that stuff before, but this was all collected in one 3-record set. And this stuff is happening blocks from my house, but I can't get into those clubs. I don't really have an access. I'm, too young. And with some fake ID that I arranged, that started to change around when I was, what would I have been? Around 17. And I was able to kind of access that, and, just going to clubs with a couple of friends because I didn't have a car. But not too long afterwards, I was asked to play rhythm guitar for certain of these people, Otis Rush and Magic Sam, that were utter heroes of mine. I mean, I can't even tell you how much they were heroes of mine. And on the other hand, when you're on stage with those people and when you're interacting with them, you can't look at this guy and say, "Oh my God, you're my hero." No, Paul, if you want to be a professional, you sort of have to be cool and, act the role that I belong here. And I learned how to do that kind of quickly and was accepted, as that, because I wasn't hired as a novelty. I was hired because this guy can play decent rhythm guitar and we can't get Louis Myers because he is out of town. So this guy is supposed to be good. And it kind of started rolling from there.
Do you remember that? You got the fake ID at 17. You probably finally get to go into some of these clubs.
Yeah.
How quickly then were you on stage? Like how soon after?
Maybe 6 months or something like that.
And it was just all word of mouth of like, look at this guy go?
Kind of begin. It begs the question. Question really makes me think, well, Paul, what was the very first gig that you did that got the ball rolling? And I'm not sure, but it may have been with Sam Lay, maybe, who was the drummer with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. And that's probably his biggest, it was certainly his claim to fame at the time. And he had gotten sick and basically they had to go with someone else, Billy Davenport. But Sam kind of went, was well known on his own and got gigs that he took me and a harmonica player buddy of mine named Jeff Karp kind of under his wing. And we were, if I say the word mentor, I guess it's right, but once again, when you're trying to be a professional, you kind of have to, you can't say, "Wow, Sam, I really appreciate all the help you're giving me," or, you kind of have to have your act together to be, to not gush, and at the same time, so I kind of really didn't think of it that way as like, I am so freaking lucky. I just basically worked to be able to play the stuff right, and I guess I did. And so people kept calling.
Do you remember what your original gear was for those early rhythm guitar sessions?
This pretty standard operating procedure of a Fender Tele. I went in at some point. A guitar of mine had been stolen. It was like a Supro or something like that. This is all in the electric world, of course. And whereas I had begun playing acoustic guitar originally, but so that when that Supro got stolen from my apartment in Chicago, I went to a pawn shop on 47th Street, which is 5 blocks from where I lived at the time. And here was this white guitar. It was kind of beat up, and kind of somebody had played it a lot because you could see already a lot of the finish was worn off. And it was a Telecaster. And it was, somebody said, later after I bought it for $75, somebody said, wow, 10083, that's 1955. All right, whatever. Whatever. Because at the time, this guy saying that was like a weird obsession that I didn't understand. He was one of the very few people that I knew who cared about what year the telly was. And I played that telly for decades. It was like we got so close, after so many years that it was my right arm or whatever. And, much later, I kind of found out that there's something about having a 55 telly. There's a numinous aspect to this thing. And this, interestingly enough, I went to University of Chicago relatively briefly, a year and a half. And there was a weird guy there who did, first off, everybody knew that he was a herpetologist and had snakes in his apartment. And the other weird thing is he talked about like old guitars and he called them vintage guitars. And my friends all thought, and I thought like, what's that mean? Anyway, George Gruen is who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And his premise utterly became gospel, of course, that not only are these older guitars, they've got something going on that newer guitars don't. And I was sort of dimly aware of that through my own experience, but I didn't know it as a gospel. And I certainly didn't know the real meaning of the word vintage. He put it on the map. And anyway, but I saw this guy semi-regularly around the UC campus. And of course, much later, realized that this 55 telly of mine was like that, But again, it was just an instrument it was a tool for the music that I was being hired to play. And it was very, very inspiring when I finally got that guitar, because all of a sudden, there's the sounds that I wanted, that kind of crystalline, slightly spiky, but you learn how to tame it with your picking kind of thing. And it was a biggie for me.
You still have it?
No. When I needed to buy my house, the house that I'm living in right now, that I've bought in 1989, I had this student and he had already kind of hooked up with Stevie Ray Vaughan and a bunch of people. He's just sort of a friend of theirs, and he knew vintage guitars in a way that was even beyond what I in 89 knew. I knew that this thing was valued, but I had bought it for $75 and I wasn't using it anymore because it just wasn't the right instrument for the gigs I was playing at the time, which were much more jazz oriented. And I had it in the closet, and it was beloved. But when he offered me $800 and I needed every cent I could get to get the down payment for this house, it's like, well, $800, nobody's ever going to offer anything like that again. I mean, this is crazy. The bubble's clearly going to burst. And I mean, I'm sure you've heard this story. We all have, from millions of people. So $800, yeah, got it. And I wouldn't say I didn't give it a second thought, but I didn't sweat it very much. And of course, I had no idea that it would be now, I don't know, $15K or whatever. No one sees, well, I shouldn't say no one, because George Gruen did, but people tend not to see that, like, this is not a bubble, Paul. This is like, this is a valuation that people your age, my age, are going to continue to have. It's not just a fad. That was hard to see at the time for real players. So every real player I know has stories like that. And I'm sure you've heard a million of them.
Let's go back to Chicago, because, I mean, obviously you filled a book with these stories. Were you accepted by everybody?
I can't necessarily say that, like, oh yeah, everybody did. Like, I don't know the scuttlebutt that might have occurred at times. For example, I know now that if I can't make a gig and then somebody gets called for it, and then all of a sudden I don't get called for that gig anymore because this younger person, it's not even a racial thing, but this young, all of a sudden this guy is now in the gig that I used to regularly get called for, but that I had to turn down, and all of a sudden I don't have that gig anymore. That I know what that's like. It doesn't mean that I hate that guy. You fucking guy, you stole my. That isn't what it is. But it's like, geez, I wish that hadn't happened. In your little fantasy, you'd like to have all the gigs. Anyway, I am sure that people like Lewis Myers and forgetting the racial component for a second, which you can't really forget, but forgetting that, I am sure that they felt like, wow, Sam doesn't call me for gigs anymore because this young white kid is doing it now. And I don't know, people say he's okay or whatever, but, and he probably, this young white kid, me, will probably play for a little less money than, after my 30, 40 years of being a professional. I don't want to play for that money, but he will. And so, it's a race thing, but it's also a money thing. Younger kids take older people's jobs because they're willing to apprentice. And if they get some guff about something or other, they'll suck it up because Sam Lay is Sam Lay instead of saying, fuck you, Sam. And so in short, that I think is at least as important as whatever racial things might play into it. So therefore, there are things like that. But generally, I get called. I got called. But also, the friendships that I made through those things were great, were unforgettable and huge, and in many respects had nothing to do with the race thing for me, or them, I think.
What was how many gigs were you playing in a typical week?
Before I moved to Vermont, I had a regular gig that was 6 nights a week, which was kind of very unusual because usually, at Pepper's Lounge or something like that, if you played, it would be 1 night, maybe 2, possibly a 3-night weekend, but not, as much as, yeah. So I kind of gave up being my freelance connections when I took that 6-night-a-week gig. And it was with 2 black guys. It was in a trio. I had taken Matt Murphy's place, which is kind of what I talk about that. And then Matt Murphy, I went to see Matt Murphy in this trio. At that time, obviously, there were 3 black guys on stage. And I realized, wow, because my drummer friend Kennard had called me and said, look, I think that Matt is going to go with James Cotton. In which case there's a 6-night-a-week gig. Maybe think about it. Maybe come down to the club and see. And I did. And here's Matt, who I knew as a blues guitarist, playing some blues, but also all these R&B hits of the day and stuff like that, and some jazz tunes. And I had aspired to do that stuff, but I wasn't really a jazz guitarist at that point. But I definitely thought this is an apprenticeship for me that I can learn that stuff. So I followed in Matt's footsteps, which is I can't even tell you what that means, but it was 6 nights a week and did not involve being on the road and I could save some money. And because it's really hard to save money playing 2-3 nights a week at $22 a night otherwise. And so I took it, and why am I saying this? Because, so that was a 6-night-a-week gig. It went from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m.
4 a.m., wow.
5 nights a week. And on Sunday, it went from 10 p.m. to Saturday night, 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. on Sunday. So the hours were ridiculous. And I got my chops together.
We all have heard horrible renditions of the blues. I think in Ghost World it was Blues Hammer or whatever the band was.
Oh,
what's the secret? Was it just your immersion in that area and being around the real deal, or were there some learning lessons you had to pick up on in terms of like how to be a legit blues player?
Well, both, of course.
Yeah.
Somehow or other, I don't think I had that many experiences of, wow, I got this, the shit slapped out of me by that, and I'll never do that again. There were not that many of those. I guess I was sort of fairly conscious of my situation here, if you know what I mean. And I also had done so much listening to, I knew that I could replicate the stuff that I had heard people do. And maybe that's the best way to put it. I knew that I could replicate that. That doesn't necessarily mean that I am entirely speaking in my own voice at the beginning of that stuff, whatever that means, but that's not what I'm being paid to do here. I'm being hired to basically, you should be Luther Tucker or Lewis Myers or Buddy Guy if you possibly can. And, and he's not here, but if you can sonically make him here, that's what you're being paid to do, particularly if you're being hired, as I was often, for rhythm guitar for somebody like Otis Rush. So you're not hired, Paul, to play like Otis Rush or Buddy Guy, because we got Otis Rush doing that. You're supposed to basically be Luther Tucker, like on those recordings, behind Otis. And I knew how to do that. And, but there are aspects of feel. I was able to pick that up somehow fairly quickly. I seem to come, I can't do, not everything in life you can enter at an acceptably high level. Ask me how I know, but that style of music, I could. I don't know why. But at some point I kept wanting to get, you can always dial something in better than you did 3 months ago. And that, I guess, is something that's way more than blues guitar, if you know what I mean. When you get close, then you listen back to a recording, if you're, or whatever, and you realize, yes, close, Paul, but yeah, you're missing something here. And that self-critique thing is, I guess I've always been that guy. And I can, you can't hear the differences until you're close. And then you realize, yeah, it's close, but listen, yeah, you're missing that part. And I got better over time.
How long, we covered you're getting a fake ID and going to those clubs for the first time. How many years as an adult working musician were you in Chicago?
Not that long. Before, when I moved to Vermont, I had been doing that quite intensely for 4 years.
And how do you go from the south side of Chicago to Vermont?
Dartboard approach to life is the only thing I'm able to say. I mean, briefly, what it was, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, my girlfriend at the time, who's still a friend, thank God, she was about to graduate from UC, University of Chicago. And I had gone there earlier, but the blues pulled me away.
Sure.
And I just kind of thought that I was going to go back because I kind of loved it. It seemed like, the road not taken, all that kind of stuff. I dug it and I respected like crazy the teachers that I had. It was all good, except like there's only 24 hours in a day and I'm spending a lot of them in blues clubs and getting home way later than I could ever manage to do classes the next morning. And at some point it's just like this, this is not right now. This is not the time when I should be doing this. And so at any rate, so she was about to graduate. I was thinking like, well, I kind of dig this, but 6 nights a week. I mean, I don't know how long I can do this for, and you get very politically cynical in a place like Chicago, the well-known situation with police, seeing the forms of corruption everywhere, of all sorts, which are, common to big cities in a way. And I love Chicago, but let's be real, it is a very, you see a very corrupt thing where one person has very little ability to affect, their life or a larger life, unless, of course, they do it through, in a sense, corruption. That's just kind of how a lot of it is. And I was intrigued by, the idea of living in a smaller community. And I knew one or two people in northern Vermont who had made exactly the same decision that I was contemplating doing. And I visited once and I kind of like this. I don't know how long I thought I would do it. I certainly had no idea that 54 years later, I would still be here and happy to be here. But anyway, it was the next turn, that life seemed to be throwing at me. And like I say, dartboard, where should we go? It made no sense for my girlfriend to go to a place where there isn't a great grad school. And it made no sense to go to a place where, as far as I could tell, there wasn't a happening urban music scene. But we both did. And once here, I realized there was a music scene that was growing in ways that I had no idea of when I moved here. And that's what kept me here.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you move and it's probably the height of the Whole Earth catalog and everyone getting back to the land, making a homestead, maybe a geodesic dome. And did you think any of your Chicago blues skills were transferable? Did you think you were going to be able to do?
Excellent question. And the answer, I think, is no. I just kind of thought, well, that's ridiculous, and so if I get a gig, if which I suspect I won't, I imagine working in a sawmill or working as a plumber or something. I don't know what the hell. I was 22 years old.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, but I realized that there was something going on here. And one of the very first gigs that I did was getting called by a friend because Big Mama Thornton was going to be playing, a show at a place called Goddard College, in Plainfield, Vermont. People possibly know that if they know the counterculture, associations with Goddard. And I had friends over there, and I was asked because I was one of the very few people in the area that sort of had a certain amount of kind of blues cred or whatever you want to call it. And I was part of that band, and that gig, or a couple of gigs that followed, were so remarkable that I wrote a story on it, which hopefully is as comical to people reading it as it was to me. And it kind of made me realize there are people in these hills that are largely urban expats, that kind of came here for very similar reasons to me. And we're all here now. And some of them are aggregating into groups and stuff like that. And I did a fair amount of that. Totally, I had never saw it coming. But at any rate, it's kept me here for 50-something years.
Well, and at what point did your focus on music expand? I mean, you went way past the blues thing with your group, and obviously, you had a little bit to do with Fish, and how did all that come to be?
Well, like I say about that gig with replacing Matt Murphy in Chicago, I had. When I was a kid, I would listen to jazz stuff, and I would just gobbledygook. I don't get it. There's no anger. There's no fire. There's no rawness. That doesn't mean that I was right about that, but I couldn't get it, especially jazz guitar. It just seemed kind of sort of dry and intellectual. And there was no, like I say, blues guitar. The thing that appealed to me was the just angry, kind of strident aspect that spoke to me hugely, being a 16-year-old kid. And anyway, so jazz was not a first love by any stretch of the imagination. But at some point, I started seeing people on the South Side playing, and I started there's a guy who was a friend of mine named David Bloom at the time, and he kind of opened my eyes. He played Wes Montgomery record, and it's yeah, I mean, the guy's really good, and but it's just, I don't know, it's so sedate, and those major seventh chords, I just can't quite get it. And then he played me George Benson, and I realized that, George Benson, I mean, there's all this bluesiness that I really dug, but it's very much on a higher level. There's a vocabulary that's so much more sophisticated, but it still has that bluesy energy and that kind of organ trio swing that like kind of got a hold of me. And I was sold, at that point. And so I started kind of doing what, I never went to school for it, but I started finding my way in that music in the same way, I guess, that I had done with earlier, Mississippi John Hurt and Lightning Hopkins, and then Buddy Guy and Otis Rush, and just trying to replicate the sounds and trying to understand there's a language here. They're not just making sounds, duh. And I guess you'd call it self-taught, but I had a 6-night-a-week gig on which, there would be 5 or 6 tunes every night, maybe more, that I could use that stuff on. And so by the time I moved to Vermont, I did have that, but like, Paul, you're not going to get a jazz gig in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of realistic about that. I was wrong, as it turned out. And but around the end of the 70s, I already had made enough friends in what was a small jazz world that I actually chose the guys like this guy's great, and made a group called Kilimanjaro. And that we actually did a lot of recording and touring nationally and overseas for a number of years before life proved to us that you're going to have a hard time actually making a living here. And you guys live in a place, Vermont, which is lovely, and you're never here anymore. And somehow the priorities of touring endlessly and making no money kind of, that life soured a bit, but those are still friends to this day, and more importantly, comrades. And you alluded to Fish, and what you're, of course, alluding to is that I was always teaching. I'd always that was something that I was able to do because unlike so many people that are musical heroes of mine and friends, I sort of saw the music that I played, and I saw it as having an underlying system to it. And I was able to sort of decode it in a way which is different than what a lot of guitar players do, because a lot of guitar players it's magic. You put your fingers in this place, and then, I don't know, people call it an F6 chord. I don't know why, but, and you make this and da-da-da, and this is how this song goes. You put your finger here and do this stuff. But like, as far as talking to a pianist and being able to have a conversation about what you're doing, guitarists are bad at that, and it's not because we're all a bunch of, kind of mentally, deficient people, but a lot of it is just the guitar does not do a good job of being an interface that makes it clear how music works. And piano does. So at any rate, I started kind of trying to decode that from a fairly early point. And one of the reasons I'm saying that is just that enabled me to teach. And I realized that by teaching, I can actually, people will ask me a question and I know how to do it, but I don't know how to explain it. And it forced me to figure out how to explain it. At any rate, I've actually loved teaching from way, way, way back then, even till now. Really dig it. And that is how I met this guitarist from UVM, University of Vermont, whose name was Trey Anastasio. And he had gone to this jazz gig every Tuesday at Sneakers for years. And he wanted to figure out how, he was already a very capable guitar player, but he wanted to decode this and how to play on guitar, kind of improvise in this way that isn't just rock improvisation. And I was more than happy to work with him. He's a fantastic student and just a sponge. He worked his ass off. Everything that Fish has done as a result of being like, I don't know if workaholic is the right word, because that implies you hate it, but you do it anyway. The work ethic is way up there with that group. So anyway, I could tell that when Trey would come over and we would do these lessons related to, arpeggios and kind of how to think about a scale over a certain chord and how to, get this chord progression and basically deal with what do you do for that first 3 seconds. And then as soon as you get here, you have to do a different thing. And he would come back and he would really have worked at it. He was a great student. And of course, we've become friends, through the years. And any rate,
how long did you guys work together, or did he hit you up for lessons?
6 months or a year, something like that. And it was, sporadic, because as with anybody who's good, like, I don't believe in the idea that what we're going to do, you have to come next week and, you have to pay me a month in advance. That's just not how I do it. So basically my arrangement with everybody has just been, when you get some of this down and you feel like you're ready for the next gulp, give me a shout. And that's how we worked. So sometimes it was sporadic, but it was over about a year's period of time.
Vermont, specifically Burlington, but all of Vermont, and maybe this is a byproduct of the whole Earth thing and everybody going back to nature, has always had this sort of vibrant Luthery community, Froggy Bottom in Vermont, and now what Adam Buchwald's doing, and Creston and all these people. At what point did you take a break from the tried and true Telecaster and whatever else you had and sort of become immersed in this world of like high-end luthier-made guitars?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have to think back. I think, well, I know that I have in part Rick Davis of Running Dog Guitars to thank for a lot of that. He was somewhat building guitars, but more importantly, he was the head of Asia, the Association of Stringed Instrument Artisans or something like that. And they would have annual and more than annual gatherings. And, obviously they were, number one, they weren't really selling, if I remember right. It wasn't like Healdsburg or something. It was more kind of information sharing, I think. It was a guild, basically. And one of the things that utterly appealed and appeals to me about that Lutheran community is that it is a guild. And by a guild, I don't just mean a bunch of people who have the same little, comma, Luthier after their name, but rather they're all aware of a history of information sharing, even though they're competitors. And I instantly realized that. And what I think after I thought about it, I realized, well, Paul, that's like your community of musicians. I mean, technically, you and your guitar player friends, you're all competitors. You're all business competitors. Yeah, but I never think of it that way. I think of it as being, we're brothers in arms. We're basically doing this crazy, stupid, poorly paying thing because we have the same values. And if I can't make this thing, I can call him and I can go and hear him play and enjoy what he's doing. And actually, I never did that before. I'm going to dig into that, down that rabbit hole. And there's a lot of information sharing going on and stuff. And of course, you obviously know this, you're a big part of it and your magazine. And so that guild thing, I was very drawn to right away. And I was hired to play at a couple of these Asia shows because one of the things they did to entertain their, the luthiers is at night, you want to kind of hear music played on guitars, and so Rick hired me because I think he saw me as being, sharing something, not just that I played okay, but, that shared sort of a common love of the guitar, but also people would say, wow, this guy that's what I'm building guitars for people like that to use. And he was right. That was a sensibility that I grew to love very, very quickly. And so and I was lucky enough to meet people and be embraced by people early on that have become, at this point, kind of lifelong friends. And just part of the commonality, I think, is for me, is that their connection with one another, a mutual support group, despite the fact they're competitors, was so much reminiscent of my musical community. And I just kind of grew to love it.
What does I see a few behind you. What does the guitar closet look like these days? What are your favorites?
Well, this is, I am embarrassed to say, a small subset, but
Sure.
Right there is Tom Rebecki's it's not a halfling, actually it's a Testadura. I have a halfling downstairs. It looks very similar from the front, but it's a deeper guitar. And here, off camera, is another Testadura that is much like that one, but this has two pickups, and I put 10s on it instead of 12s. Guitarists will know what I mean. And as a result of having 10s and 12s, it instantly turns into being more like kind of a singing, whether it's, Robin Ford or Larry Carlton or whatever, kind of a lead electric guitar that you can bend strings on and sing on, whereas that has 12s. And as much as that seems like a silly distinction, I very much think for any given gig, am I going to bring the clearly jazz bebop guitar, or am I going to bring the screaming, well, doesn't have to scream, but, singing bendable strings guitar? And the fact is, I have both. So I'm very fortunate. Thank you. And thank you, Tom. So that is a wonderful archtop built by Chris Mirabella. That's just an astonishingly nice guitar. And I love it. And it's unfortunately a little less practical for many of the gigs I play for all kinds of reasons, but it records beautifully. And I've used that a number of times, and I play it at home all the time. And that is a guitar that I've had for, maybe 30 years now or something. Or maybe at least 25, that was built by Julius Borges. It's basically an OM flat top. And I'm ashamed to say that there are others, but those are the ones that, I kind of keep up here.
Those are all very solid guitars. Hearing you talk about the 10s versus 12s made me think, I bet in Chicago you were handed a lot of guitars that for most people would be unplayable.
That's a really, really good point. And in fact, I had no idea of that notion of guitar setup, which is kind of what we're, in action. I'd heard that word. I wasn't quite sure what it meant. But when that first Supro that was stolen, if I would love to go back in time and check out how it was set up, and, because I used it somewhat. But when I got the Telly, that 55 Telly, it was like, oh my God, wow. And I am sure that, it wasn't, because it's a expensive vintage. Paul, it was $75. It was not a iconic guitar in my mind, but it was set up really nicely. And I now realize, well, Paul, the setup is not the guitar. The Supro may have been, I know you know what I mean, and so do our listeners. But at the time, I had no idea. So that Supro probably was a bear to play. And, maybe, who knows, maybe it's a miracle that I could play it at all. But learning on it kind of made it so that when I got the Telly that really was wonderfully set up, I now realize in retrospect, it made me appreciate the difference.
Yeah. And I'm sure dealing with all these luthiers who are now part of your circle, like you're giving them real world player feedback that not only influences whatever guitar you order, but whatever they're building in the future.
You are exactly correct. And I don't want to be falsely modest. I love the guitars that they build in general. But there definitely is player feedback that's hugely important. And one of the best eye openers about acoustic setup that I got was from TJ Thompson, who's grown over the last, 30 years to be a really, really dear friend. And I remember him talking about something where he said, well, I could hot rod this for you. And I like, what do you mean? Like exhaust pipes coming out? No. I mean, I sort of knew what he meant, but then he went on to explain quite clearly that, it's possible. You have to work hard at it and everything has to be right. But it's possible to make a guitar that has a really quite low action, as low as it can go without buzzing. And I knew that term, but the idea that there's a science to this and that there are some very specific things that have to happen, kind of high tolerances that have to be observed so that you have a guitar where it speaks and it actually sounds as good as the guitar is capable of being and yet plays easily. And he was sort of saying, I could do that, and would you like me to do that? Yeah. And, that set a new bar for me for sure of like, oh, and now when I I have a student guitar, that whenever students come over and they don't have their guitar here, it's a 42 Martin 0018. And that sounds like, oh my God. Yeah, but it's been through the mill. And from a collector standpoint, I mean, it's got, got all kinds of repairs and replaced bridge plate, and it's kind of a mess, but it's set up beautifully. And I never make a big deal out of it, but I find a lot of joy and appreciation in repeating my thing, my own history, when I'll just have it and somebody won't be, well, here, you can use this guitar. And then I said, oh, this is what they're saying. Oh, wow. That's okay. And then the lesson proceeds. And 2 or 3 times later, lessons later, somebody will say, by the way, what's the deal with this guitar?
I was going to say, who's bringing their own guitar when that's the other option?
Yeah. And I love when somebody will say, what's the deal with this guitar? Because to me, I never said a peep about this is a vintage guitar, 1942 Martin. It's worth a lot. It's not really worth a lot of money because it's been so boogered over the years. But the whole point of why these are called, vintage guitars, and the whole point of them being kind of magical in a way, it goes, you can see it without somebody kind of pounding at it. And I love it when, say, a college student will ask that question. He may or may not be able to ever afford, or may not be able to afford now that guitar, but he kind of will remember, like, oh yeah, it was so easy to play, and you just strike it and then the sound would come out. And it was just like so big sounding from this little guitar. And, that is the common experience and that's the point of those older guitars. And at any rate, I thank TJ in my mind every time that, that I have that. And then me passing on the idea that guitars can be like that without my ever having to give a lecture on it. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. It helps to know TJ.
That's true.
So this book, again, Stages, is the title of it. Where should, I know a lot of people, probably their spouses are, what do you want for Christmas or whatever? Like, this seems like for anyone who's made it this far and is listening to this podcast on a regular basis, like this is what we talk about. Where do folks find it? Where is it?
Well, the way that I would prefer, and it's relatively easy, is to go on my website, which is paulasbell.com. Pretty original, paulasbell.com. There's a page called Shop. And in addition to tabs and CDs and stuff, the Stages book is there. And it's not the only place to get it. You could get it on Amazon, and then maybe I would make 25 cents or whatever, and we'd be supporting Jeff Bezos. But I would prefer it if somebody, got it from my website, and my fulfillment arm, which is me, will send it out quite quickly. Signed, as a matter of fact.
I was going to say Onion River Press. Is that you, or is that?
Oh, no. And that's another way to get it, although I guess it would be similarly a mail order situation. And if you live in a city that has a bookstore, they can order it too. And of course, I'm not going to vibe people that they shouldn't do that, but I would prefer it if they would order it from my website. And but all of these are options.
Yeah. And then they can book a guitar lesson with you.
Well, there's that too.
Play that Martin.
Yeah, it's right there, just waiting.
Snowstorm willing, what's next on your agenda music-wise?
Well, once I get over this sort of attack of back pain, I will be kind of filling my calendar more with gigs. But there's actually, I hate to say it, there's a gig in Memphis that I am booked to do with my dear friend Elizabeth Von Trapp and it's not a blues gig, as you could probably guess. And we were going to fly in about 10 days to do it. I just, my back may prevent me from doing that, but there are plenty of things of that nature that are, occasionally fly gigs, but more often regional to where I live here. Jazz gigs, funk soul gigs, acoustic, things, doing my own kind of thing. And on and on they go.
I love it. Paul, it's a joy to talk to you as always. Hopefully we'll drag you again to Chicago, where obviously, I mean, you could just be reading stories from this book at the next summit and everybody would be happy. Thanks for being a part of the show.
Thank you. It's great. I'm just delighted that you reached out, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Fretboard Summit, one way or the other.
All right, that was my conversation with Paul Asbell. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, the book is called Stages. I'm including a link in the show description, so just go over there and nab that book while you can. And thanks as always for tuning in to the Fretboard Journal podcast.